When Marjorie Taylor Greene showed up to provide moral support to fellow MAGA cultist and top Trump advisor Steve Bannon as he reported to prison to serve a 4-month federal sentence, they were both relentlessly mocked and heckled by the crowd, and we have to talk about it. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. These are two remarkably unlikable and dangerous people who wield enormous power within the Republican Party. Steve Bannon, a top Trump advisor, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the best fundraisers in the MAGA Republican Party. And I want to show you these clips. This is basically Steve Bannon hosting his last MAGA War Room podcast before he has to serve a 4-month federal prison sentence despite doing everything in his power to avoid it. We're going to play these clips and unpack them together.
Nothing. They voted for Republicans to do their job. And sitting around and saying, oh, we're wait. That is not good enough. Never surrender! All over the country. This is multiplying the war room costs by 10,000.
Hopefully 10,000%.
So, again, where are the Democrats? They're the ones heckling you right now, you morons. Love this stuff. This is awesome. So, again, for context, Steve Bannon, and we'll go into an article kind of exploring the full case history of what's going on with Steve Bannon. But he defied a congressional subpoena by the House January 6th Select Committee back when Democrats were in the majority. And there was a full-on legal battle. It had many ups and downs, but at the end of the day, Bannon lost. And as a consequence of his defiance, he has to report to serve a 4-month prison sentence. A couple of other clips I want to show you.
In the Republican-controlled House that has been the problem all along. The fact that Steve did not obey that congressional subpoena was the right thing to do because the committee was illegitimate from the
Traitor, traitor, traitor. And they are. They really are. These are the least, pro-American, pro-patriotic people in existence. They want to install Donald Trump as an unelected dictator. They don't even say, they're not even proud to call America a democracy anymore. They say, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, right? Because what they really want is to enshrine minority rule and to oppress and suppress minorities and women and marginalized groups in the LGBTQ community, et cetera, and so forth. They recognize that their policies and their ideas are wildly unpopular, but they don't care because they have so many systemic and institutional advantages. So Steve Bannon and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they are absolute cultists for Donald Trump. With Bannon, I'm not sure if it's genuine or if it's an act or if he thinks that Trump is a vehicle to affect his, preferred political policies like the Heritage Foundation clearly believe about Trump. They don't like Donald Trump. They obviously think he's an idiot, but they think he's a useful political proxy. Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the other hand, she's definitely, part of the cult. She's a true believer. And she's so deluded, as a matter of fact, that during the very chaotic press conference, she talks about January 6th, the insurrection that her cult leader instigated. And she says it was Nancy Pelosi's fault. And Nancy Pelosi nearly got Marjorie Taylor Greene killed by Trump supporters. I don't know.
I was a brand new member of Congress. I'd only been there 3 days. 3 days. I could have been killed because of Nancy Pelosi. She did not secure the Capitol for anyone.
Now, of course, as we discussed, again, we are not obligated to take their arguments at face value. They're dumber than us. They're morally bankrupt. They are hypocrites in the extreme. But let's do it as an exercise because we always win, even if we give them the benefit of the doubt. We always win the arguments. Let's grant the premise that Nancy Pelosi was somehow responsible for the security of the Capitol, but it was still Donald Trump's supporters who were stirred into a murderous, riotous frenzy because of lies that he told, and by the way, that you too helped tell Marjorie Taylor Greene. So it's almost like, give you an analogy, being attacked by a criminal and blaming not the criminal for attacking you, but your neighbor or the police for failing to stop it in time. That makes no sense whatsoever. Even if we grant the premise, at the end of the day, Donald Trump is infinitely more responsible morally, civically, perhaps legally, course, we've talked about a recent Supreme Court decision, which has thrown that into chaos. But even if we grant the premise, Donald Trump is just objectively at fault here, and she wants to pretend that he's not, and instead shift the burden to Nancy Pelosi. Now, of course, we don't, again, have to grant the premise there because she's lying, of course. As Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi was not responsible for deploying the National Guard. She wasn't responsible for anything like that. At the end of the day, it was Donald Trump, as the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, including the National Guard, as the Chief Executive, as the person who is constitutionally charged with vesting or taking care that all the laws be faithfully executed. That's on Trump, not Pelosi. And Pelosi requested help, as did Republicans, and they were ignored. Donald Trump he sat in a private office in the White House, and he watched the insurrection unfold and didn't do anything about it, despite his obligation, his civic executive obligation, which is higher by far than any other elected representative, including Speaker Pelosi, and his obligation, his authority over the cult itself. Because again, he had dual responsibilities. As the leader of this riotous insurrectionist mob, he had the power and the obligation to call them off, and he didn't. And as, again, the President of the United States and the figure ultimately responsible for law enforcement, national security, he had that obligation as well to stop the insurrection and plenty of resources with which to do it. But again, he and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Steve Bannon and all the others, they want to absolve Trump of any culpability and blame it instead on Nancy Pelosi for failing to stop Trump supporters from trying to murder her and Vice President Pence and everyone in Congress. Insane stuff. Now let's get into the situation with Steve Bannon. So CNN breaks it down. Steve Bannon, a former Donald Trump White House strategist, reported to federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut on Monday to begin a 4-month sentence for defying a congressional subpoena. Bannon is the second former aide to be imprisoned for a contempt of Congress conviction after Peter Navarro began serving a 4-month sentence earlier this year and was taken into custody shortly after noon Eastern time. He was driven into the federal prison in a black van after speaking at a podium outside the correctional facility, saying he was proud to go to prison. Again, that's the press conference that we saw. It's basically the de facto last episode of the MAGA War Room podcast. Both Bannon and Navarro were convicted for not complying with subpoenas issued to them by the now defunct January 6th Select Committee. The Supreme Court on Friday denied a long-shot effort by Bannon to avoid a prison sentence while he challenges his conviction before the Federal Appeals Court in D.C. Bannon said that he was not thumbing his nose at the House committee, but rather relying on advice from his attorneys to not respond to the subpoena until lawmakers worked out Trump's claims of executive privilege in the matter. Courts did not allow him to argue that to the jury that decided his case. So the other thing to remember is that Navarro and Bannon tried to assert executive privilege, right? Which is, again, found nowhere in the Constitution, but it's accepted for both Republican and Democratic presidents that, listen, to maintain separation of powers, to make the executive somewhat independent and not totally submissive to the legislative and judicial branches, the President of the United States can assert executive privilege and say, hey, listen, if you want something from me, if you want testimony, if you want papers, if you want evidence or whatever, like if you are demanding something of me, the president, there are some things I can say, no, this is covered by executive privilege. I'm not going to give it to you. I don't have to give it to you. And if you still want it, you got to take me to court. And then the judiciary has to get involved and rule in either of our favors. They didn't rule in Bannon's favor. They didn't rule in Navarro's favor. And part of that was because President Biden did not honor their claims of executive privilege because he wasn't obligated to. Trump wasn't in office at that point. So they were asserting executive privilege on behalf of a chief executive who was no longer serving. And very often, current presidents honor those requests, but they're not obligated to. President Biden is ultimately the president. He's the one who decides executive privilege, not Steve Bannon, not Peter Navarro. And he's like, no, I'm not giving them executive privilege. No, I'm waiving it. I'm waiving executive privilege. So that shield that Bannon and Navarro thought they had went away, which is hilarious. Love it. But he's trying to put on a brave front. He's like, listen, I'm going to be more powerful in prison than I am now. Bannon said last week, he's like an evil Obi-Wan. If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. I mean, and I don't know. Listen, he wants to position himself as a martyr. He's hoping that his conviction, his imprisonment will rally up the MAGA base and rile up the MAGA cult. And maybe it will. Maybe that's the same thing. You can't predict anything with MAGA. All I know is I wouldn't want to be serving a 4-month federal prison sentence. I imagine pretty much everybody can find something better to do with their time, but that's the situation for Bannon. And I love the fact that he was heckled by he and Marjorie Taylor Greene were heckled by this crowd when they're so used to this, these absolute cultists standing before them to celebrate them. And instead, they were relentlessly heckled. Let me know what you think in the comments.